I will introduce our special guest in a moment, but I want to first say that how glad we are to have you here, Hope College students, faculty, and community members. I am Brian Nwari, a senior economics major and third-year member of Markets and Morality. On behalf of Markets and Morality, my colleagues and friends seated here to your right, I want to say that we are honored to be hosting this event as part of the Kirk on Campus initiative by the Russell Kirk Center. The Kirk Center is dedicated to providing educational seminars, research opportunities, all to defend what the late acclaimed scholar Russell Kirk called the permanent things. That is, the beliefs and institutions that are the foundations of Western civilization and that point to the true, the good, and the beautiful. These permanent things include, but are not limited to, the family, political institutions that ensure order, freedom, and justice, and the primacy of the transcendent in our lives. I've personally attended a number of enriching seminars held at the Kirk Center in Mecosta, Michigan, in Russell Kirk's personal and quite impressive library myself, and that I found to be very rigorous and formative. We're so glad to have the director of the Kirk Center, Jeff Nelson, here tonight, and we're grateful to him and the staff of the Russell Kirk Center who partnered with us in this event and made Dr. Gregg's visit here possible. On behalf of the Russell Kirk Center and Markets and Morality, I also want to thank our campus co-sponsors, the Department of Political Science and the Department of Economics and Business, for their support. The Kirk Center has been a great friend to Markets and Morality over the years. They have actually been coming to Hope and having events since 2017, and this is because we share a vision for inquiry and education in the permanent things. To the curious listener, Markets and Morality is at its core a book club. But it's also more than that, in that we are all engaged and share a concern for human flourishing, and we aim to promote the life of the mind here at Hope College. So, on top of our stimulating weekly conversations and discussions, M&M hosts speakers and scholars here on campus to bring to the campus at large a chance to learn and reflect about what our friends at the Kirk Center call the true, the good, and the beautiful. So a note to the students here, if you're interested in learning more about who we are, please find one of us or our director, Professor Sarah Stell, and we'd love to tell you about how you can get more involved in the future. Now, we are privileged this evening to have the opportunity to have a conversation with Dr. Samuel Gregg. To my fellow students especially, I'd ask that you would sit tight and listen intently and prepare to ask questions during the Q&A period that will conclude our time here this evening. You'll get to know Dr. Gregg's work in the next hour, and so I will keep my remarks and my introduction brief. But Dr. Gregg is a political economist who received his doctorate in moral philosophy and political economy at Oxford University. He has authored 16 books, including The Essential Natural Law, The Commercial Society, and most recently, The Next American Economy, Nation, State, and Markets in an Uncertain World, which will be available for purchase after our event this evening. Dr. Gregg was a director of research at the nearby Acton Institute in Grand Rapids, but has for the last couple years conducted his work at the American Institute for Economic Research, where he was just recently named Friedrich Hayek Chair in Economics and Economic History. Please join me in welcoming our special guest, Dr. Samuel Gregg. Dr. Gregg, let me begin by saying it was an absolute pleasure reading your recent book, The Next American Economy. You mentioned that the impetus of the book is to address the phenomenon that we are seeing both on the left and the right, where political leaders and their constituents are calling for more government intervention in order to preserve or reclaim what they deem is the common good. So before we begin to evaluate their proposed policies, would you be able to explain what the common good is and isn't, and how it has historically been understood in the Western Christian tradition?
Nice, easy question to start off with, right?
Yeah.
So before I begin answering that, I'd like to thank the Russell Kirk Center for having me here. Thanks to Dr. Nelson, who I've known a very long time, for having me. Professor Estelle, it's very good to see you again. It's great to be here as well. Thank you to the Markets and Morality Club, and thank you to the Department of Economics and Business and the Department of Politics. I got it all right. Excellent. Good, so thank you to all those. It's wonderful to be back in Michigan. I don't get back here as much as I should. As was mentioned, I worked at the Acton Institute for 21 and a half years, and I lived in Grand Rapids for a while, and I lived in Ann Arbor. But I still come back for Acton University, which is in June this year, and I believe they're still open for people to apply. I heartily recommend that people go if they can. So, your question about the common good is, I think, a very important one, because it's an idea that is, of course, very old. You can go back to, as we do for most of these things, back to the ancient world, to people like Plato, Aristotle, Cicero. You go forward into the medievals with people like Aquinas and other scholastic thinkers who use this phrase extensively. You can find it used by, since I'm at Hope College, I should mention this, Reform scholastic thinkers writing in places like Switzerland and the Netherlands in the 17th and 18th century. It's expressed in Enlightenment ideas. I think you find intimations of it in the expression the general welfare, which is in part of the United States Constitution. But of course today there's immense argument about what this expression actually means. And I've discovered when you ask questions about what people mean by this, they mean all sorts of different things. For some people, it's a type of commitment to the sort of well-being of other people. Others, however, will say things like, well, it's essentially about the necessity of government to intervene into civil society and the economy in order to deliver more just outcomes than would otherwise be delivered by markets and relatively free associations. So you have a lot of argument about what this phrase means, and it's important because, as Brian mentioned, on both the left and the right today, this phrase is being invoked by people ranging from Senator Marco Rubio in Florida to Senator Elizabeth Warren in Massachusetts, two politicians who you think would have very little to do with each other, very little in common. But they're both invoking much of the same vocabulary and language, and for the most part, in their cases, it's about a philosophical rationale for having the government intervene in the economy. Sometimes on very extensive levels, sometimes very specific parts of the economy, but that's essentially what they mean by that. So what do I mean by the phrase, the common good? Well, I think the best way to think about it is that there's a sort of overall common good, which is the well-being, the good of everyone and every community that has ever existed in human history. That's a sort of very broad generic term that you can find in the ancients and in the medievals. But when you come to the early modern period, to Enlightenment thinkers, and certainly by the time of the American founding, the phrase means something more specific. And what it means is those types of conditions that are a prerequisite if people are going to be able to make free choices that promote their own human flourishing and that of others. So that cashes out in all sorts of different ways. It means things like, well, if it's about people ultimately flourishing, and it means that people have to make free choices in order to flourish, then that implies that the common good involves a high degree of liberty. A high degree of liberty, whether it's economic liberty, civil liberty, political liberty, religious liberty. Because without these without these freedoms, we can't flourish. We can't really realize virtue as that phrase is properly understood. But it also means, I think, certain sets of institutions that have to exist if we're going to be living in a free and virtuous society, or at least a society that takes liberty and the moral good very seriously. So what are some of those conditions? Well, I would argue things like private property rights, enforcement of contract, rule of law. I would argue a functioning and dynamic and competitive market economy. I would mean things like a rigorous and dynamic civil society. I would mean all sorts of constitutional protections that ensure that government is focused on certain activities and is not allowed for the most part to go beyond certain defined activities. So that, I think, is what some people would call the political common good. And it's very different from the common good of the family. It's very different from the common good of a religious institution. It's very different from the common good of every person and society that's ever existed in human history. So in other words, I think the common good that I'm talking about has a very specific meaning. And I think if you take that meaning seriously, it raises a lot of questions about many of the economic ideas and economic policies that we're seeing coming from both the left and the right, all of which are driven by a focus upon using government to try and realize specific economic and social goals that people on the left and the right do not think are being adequately delivered or even capable of being delivered in the economic sphere, at least, by free markets.
Thank you. So it would seem as though a free market approach is part and parcel of your vision for the common good. But in your book, you mentioned that one reason why so many people often forgo or leave behind a pure free market approach is because they want to protect either marginalized community or they want to protect, say, manufacturing jobs. So the claim is they want to protect them all from the bulldozer of progress that is the free market. The criticism then is that the proponents of free markets will idly stand by as the bulldozer crushes some people. I actually came across a cartoon that had the same idea. It was mountains of skeletons, and there's this man standing there, and I'm guessing the skeletons is from a collapse of an industry. And the man is standing there talking to the skeleton saying, well, it's okay, the free market will work this all out eventually. So what do you think about this caricature of the free market? What is your response to this, and how does it compare to your vision for, say, a commercial republic?
So, when it comes to people talking about the market economy, I think there's often a tendency to see it as there's this thing out there called the market that's sort of operating above and beyond any of our control, and it's this type of abstract colossus that runs roughshod over particular marginalized communities. It's ruthless in terms of things like creative destruction, in terms of the pursuit of profit, etc., etc. I think you all know the vision that's often presented of markets in that way. And again, this is a vision of markets that you can find. Traditionally, we've often thought of this as being something that the political left has portrayed markets as being. But certainly over the past, I would argue, 15 years, we've seen significant figures on the political right embrace this understanding of markets as well. And I think it's a mistaken understanding of what markets are about and what constitutes markets. The way that I typically describe markets is markets begin with individuals and groups making choices about what they want in the context of economic goods and services. It's about other people deciding that they want to meet those economic goods and services, those needs, the economic needs that people have. It means these people selling to each other, buying from each other, trading with each other, all on a voluntary basis. It means a society in which commerce rather than the ancient Greek polis or the feudal system of the medieval period, or an economy that is dominated by the state. It's a very distinct type of economy to all those different manifestations of political economy that have happened, some in relatively recent history. The market is also something in which entrepreneurship, people acting freely, being creative in the economy, are given the freedom and the scope to be able to exercise that innate creativity, which I think is one of the things that makes us different from the animals. It's also an economy in which free will and free choice is taken seriously in a way that is less obvious in other economic arrangements. But I should also say there's an institutional dimension to markets as well. Markets don't work. Markets can't even really sustain themselves, let alone arise in the first place, unless you have certain institutions firmly in place. Things like private property and the ability to buy and sell private property as you see fit, according to your own needs and desires and wants. It implies rule of law. You really can't have a market economy unless you have these institutions that we call rule of law firmly in place. I don't think you can have a market economy that functions as we want it to unless you have constitutionally limited government. It's very difficult to sustain markets unless you have firm constitutional limits defining what governments can and cannot do, including in the economy. And even beyond that, I would say a market economy also involves a certain type of culture, a certain type of norms, a certain set of virtues, without which even the best constitutional system and even the best, most stable rule of law system will struggle to persist. What do I mean by these virtues? Well, I think it's very much described very well in Adam Smith's favorite book, which, by the way, is not The Wealth of Nations. I know there are people in this audience who have read the corpus of Adam Smith's many works, and I'm sure Professor Estelle is one of them, and she and others would probably tell you that Adam Smith's favorite work was not his Wealth of Nations. His most favorite work was his Theory of Moral Sentiments, published in 1759. And it's really a work of moral psychology. It reflects him working out a theory of morality based partly upon the insights of his great friend, David Hume, but also the insights of the person he described as his great teacher, who was Dr. Francis Hutchinson, who was a Presbyterian minister, I should add, as well. But towards the end of his life, Smith engaged in some extensive revisions of his theory of moral sentiments. He actually added a whole section 6, which is called Of the Virtues. And he talks there about 3 sets of virtues. One is commercial virtues. So things like self-restraint, things like a willingness to deny yourself certain things in order that you can get certain things later. Risk-taking, being industrious, etc. These are sort of what he called commercial virtues that are harder to find in, say, a feudal society or the society of a polis. But he said that's not enough. You also need what he called the classical virtues. And by that he really has in mind the virtues of Greece and Rome, and which were very standard reference points for a lot of Enlightenment thinkers. You find this phrase, self-command, everywhere in the works of Scottish Enlightenment thinkers. You also find it in a good number of the American founders, this expression and emphasis on this idea of self-command. It's a sort of self-discipline, that I will choose to live my life in this disciplined way rather than living in this sort of dissolute manner. But he said even that's not enough. He said you also need the virtue of benevolence. And by benevolence, I think he means religious virtues. Now, Smith, I don't think, is a Christian. I think Smith is very much a deist. He refers primarily to things like providence. He uses a lot of Enlightenment language to describe what we would call today natural theology. But he does believe that you do need this other seeking virtue, Well, and he calls it, he in one point he describes it as the great commandment of Christianity, to love one's neighbour as oneself. So Smith was very clear that if you're going to have what he called a commercial society, which is his way of talking about a market economy, but in a more expansive way than just literally the market, he said you need all these other things, but you especially need these types of virtues. Because without these commercial virtues, classical virtues, and the virtues of benevolence, he didn't think that markets would be able to function over the long term.
Excellent. Well, on the topic of what benefits the markets and what allows them to function, one thing that often comes up is free trade. So kind of going foreign. And you make the bold claim in your book that exposure to competition, including foreign competition, benefits America and Americans. That is a bold claim, and
especially today.
And indeed, altogether unpopular opinion.
And super unpopular.
Yeah, I guess one of the things, the critics that blame free trade and globalization, they say that it undermines the U.S. working class. And so they've also been known to lambast two policy choices in particular. The first being in 2000s, the U.S. granting China permanent normal trading relations. And the second in 2001, allowing China entry into World Trade Organization. So the question seemingly still stands, was normalizing trade with China a mistake? Is free trade a mistake? What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so let's go from theory and principle to specifics of China. It's up there, right? China. So, yes, it is everywhere. So let's start with the idea of free trade. So we just talked about Adam Smith. He's really the first to articulate in a systematic social science form the argument for free trade over what was called the mercantilist system that dominated the 18th century European world, and therefore the rest of the world for the most part. There had been others who had talked about free trade before that, but Smith was the one, including, for example, people like Hugo Grotius, one of the great Protestant scholastic thinkers, Dutchman, I should say that since I'm here in Hope College. And he talked about a natural right to trade that wasn't limited by barriers. But Smith articulated the classic economic argument for free trade, which is that when you have free trade, you expand the size of the market. So you go beyond national boundaries and people are able to trade more or less freely across national boundaries. Why is this good? Well, it widens the circle of consumers. So that means bigger markets for business people to sell more goods and services. It induces more competition. And competition is good because competition keeps us disciplined. Competition forces us to think about efficiency. It forces us to think about innovation. It forces us, as any business person will tell you, to think about margins of profit. Competition is this disciplining effect that permeates everything that we do in the economy. So the bigger the economy, the bigger the consumer market, the more discipline that is imposed upon us by the conditions of free trade. The end result is more efficiency, more innovation, more effectiveness, more trade, which means more wealth, which means more and more people getting out of poverty, which I think is something we should take very seriously. It allows more and more specialization. Again, it makes us wealthier, it grows the amount of wealth, and we move away from the mercantilist type of economic system and arrangements, which is basically a view of the economy as fixed, as static, and that if you want to grow wealth, you have to take it from other people. So Smith laid out this argument in The Wealth of Nations. It was subsequently further clarified by people like Ricardo when he talked about things like comparative advantage, conditions of free trade. More individuals, more communities, more nations are able to discover what's their comparative advantage When you do that, you can specialize, you can engage in a wider division of labor, all of which continues to speed up the process by which wealth grows. And when wealth grows, more and more people escape poverty. As the overall wealth in a society grows, all sorts of other things start to happen as well. We start to have more resources for education, for philanthropy. We can be more generous with other people. There's more opportunities for people to do more things because we simply have many more resources. So that's the theory, right? So those of you who have done economics, this is not revolutionary or strange for you. So let's move it down to the conditions of today. So free trade is under attack from both the left and the right now, and that's change. I think it's fair to say that most of the right and significant segments of the left certainly from the 1980s into the 1990s, I would argue up until around about the 2008 financial crisis, free trade was more or less the consensus economic position of Americans and certainly American policymakers between that period of time. And that's why we had things like normalization of trade relations with China. That's why we had NAFTA, initially promoted by a Republican president, passed by a Democratic president with support from both parties in Congress, etc., etc. So it was the orthodoxy. That's all gone. And that, I think, started to disintegrate in 2008, but it really started to accelerate in the mid-2000s, when I think you saw the rise of economic populism on both the left and the right. And if you look at the trade policies that have been put forward and are still being put forward by the two people who are most likely to be running for president this year, when it comes to trade policy, they're more or less in the same position. That's not often talked about, but Donald Trump and Joseph Biden more or less have the same position on trade. And it's a heavily protectionist position. It's one that favors industrial policy. We have certainly moved away from the free trade consensus. So why has this happened? Well, I think there's all sorts of reasons. China is one of the reasons. So part of the argument is that by allowing China to come into the World Trade Organization, America acquired more extensive access to a bigger consumer market, and we got to buy lots and lots of cheap goods from China. So it was very good for American consumers. I would still argue it was very good for American consumers. It was also very good for American exporters, who were able to export all sorts of things to China, to this very big market, consumer market of 1.4 billion people in China. There was also the argument that was very popular at the time and was associated with people like Francis Fukuyama in his famous article, The End of History and the Last Man, which he basically argues that the world is headed in the direction of market economies and liberal democracy, and it's only just a question of how quickly all of us get there. So, as a very young man in the 1980s and 1990s, I remember very distinctly lots and lots of people arguing this, saying, if China comes into the World Trade Organization, it will obviously become more economically liberalized. This will gradually lead to the political liberalization of China. You can go back to the year 1999 and the year 2000, and you can find William Jefferson Clinton, George W. Bush being asked the same question about China coming into the WTO and basically making the same argument. So while I would say that all the economic arguments about China coming into the WTO, the subsequent competition that introduced into the United States economy, I think that was all good. I think the acquisition of a big consumer market was good. I think the reduction of prices for Americans was very good. But I would argue that there was a political miscalculation. What was the political miscalculation? The political miscalculation was that China did not move down the path of political liberalization. So one of the things that people like me who are free traders have to be very clear about now is that economic liberalization does not necessarily lead to political liberalization. Sometimes it can help, but if you are talking about a society like China, 1.4 billion people, with really no history or culture of things like constitutionalism, rule of law, a society which has been always ruled from the top down, has always had an emperor figure, whether it's the Manchu emperors or Mao or Xi today, its political culture is one of top-down authoritarianism. And it turns out that political culture is very, very important and much more resilient than I think many people anticipated. So I think that's part of the problem, and I think many free traders were mistaken in making this argument that it would inevitably lead to the political liberalization of what would certainly accelerate the process by which political liberalization had occurred. And obviously it hasn't happened. So that has hurt the case for free trade. Not the economic case, but I think those of us who are free traders have to be more circumspect about making the connection between economic freedom and political freedom. So that's one thing. The second political question, of course, is what happened to manufacturing, at least American manufacturing. And there's a popular narrative about that. The narrative is that by China coming into the WTO, American manufacturing couldn't compete. Therefore, it started to shrink. It meant job layoffs. It meant factories closing in particular parts of the United States. So that's the popular narrative, and it's gained traction on both sides of politics. But I also think it's a false narrative. Why do I say that? I say that because manufacturing in the United States, in terms of numbers of people employed, has been declining since the 1970s. So this is before China embarked upon any type of economic liberalization at all. Also, when you start to look at the reasons why manufacturing employment has declined, the best studies that I've looked at, and I talk about them in the book, they indicate that to the extent that there was a quote-unquote China shock, it probably contributed to something like 10 to 20% of manufacturing job losses in America, which means that 90 to 80% of job losses had nothing to do with China. The number one reason why manufacturing jobs has declined in the United States is because of technology. Technology. If you go into a factory, any factory in the United States today, what do you see? You don't see men who look curiously like men from the 1950s, dressed in 1950s clothes, doing heavy, laborious, often quite dangerous work. What you tend to see is people walking around in white lab coats. A good number of them are engineers. A lot of them are also women. And they're doing high-tech manufacturing. So the American manufacturing sector not only became much more technologically driven and focused, it also moved into the area of high-tech manufacturing, which is less labor intensive. I should also mention that while we have seen this decline in the number of overall people working in manufacturing, the American job market as a whole has grown by tens of millions that far outstrip the number of jobs that were lost in manufacturing. And lots of people who once upon a time would have worked in manufacturing, as I said, often very hard, very difficult, very laborious, sometimes dangerous work, and now working in the service sector, where they're earning more money, they're not in any physical danger, and their hours and conditions of work are often much better. And frankly, you want people moving from the manufacturing sector into the service sector, because that is a classic sign that an economy is growing and making the types of technological leaps that it needs to do. So that's my explanation of what's happened with manufacturing. It's one that is counter, I think, the narrative that you hear on the left, but also on the right now. But it's a very hard one to sell, because I've just taken, 10 minutes to explain it to you. Right.
They're sold. They're sold. So you just talked to us about political culture, sort of. I'd be curious about what, since our focus is also on families, what is your take on why strong families are a critical part of your vision of the commercial republic? See, because given their importance, you also notice the breakdown of families that is often mentioned. What do you also say to that? Is that something for the government to step into, or is that something more for families and civil society?
Yes, so there's no question, if you look at the work of scholars like Nicholas Eberstadt, if you look at a lot of the work that's being done by economists like Catherine McCulloch at the Catholic University of America, if you look at some of the work done by Brad Wilcox on what's happened with family dynamics over the past 30 to 40 years in the United States, there's no question that there are some serious dysfunctionalities in the American family. Whether it's the very high divorce rate, whether it's the very high level of cohabitation, whether it's young men not working, choosing not to work, it's a phenomenon that's starting to seep over among young women now as well, whether it's the degree and amount of drug use by young people in the United States today. These are all real things. These are all serious problems. There's serious dysfunctionalities. And I don't think the economy actually has very much to do with it at all. Yes, the American economy has gone through some dramatic changes over the past 30 to 40 years. But society has changed a lot as well. We've had what people, I think, would accurately describe as a very major cultural revolution, even a sexual revolution from the 1960s onwards, which challenged traditional notions of family, which in many respects presented these things as oppressive and patriarchal, and all these things you already know. And I would argue that those social and cultural forces have done much more damage to people's conception of what family is, what marriage is, etc., than anything to do with the economy. So what does this mean? Well, I don't think that government is particularly good at putting families back together. I think in terms of healing our society of these serious dysfunctionalities in family life, in marital life, etc., this is something that is primarily the responsibility of civil society associations. It's particularly a responsibility of religious associations. This is what they do. And in fact, Americans have a very long history and tradition of this. Americans has a very strong tradition of civil society addressing these type of social and cultural problems that people like Alexis de Tocqueville, when he came to America in the early 1830s, noticed immediately. He noticed immediately when there were problems in a community, there were problems in a region, in a town. Americans didn't run off to the federal government and say, hey, fix all these problems for us. They formed the habit of association and they fixed it themselves. And this was very different to Tocqueville's native France, where he said, you know, if you have a complaint with your neighbor in Marseille, you don't go and talk to your neighbor or go chat with the local parish priest. You write a letter to the Ministry of the Interior in Paris and ask them to fix the problem. So government is not the best way of dealing with these types of problems, because government is generally very bad at dealing with what we might call social and cultural dysfunctionalities. So while work is very important, I think for dignity in itself, for adding discipline to people's lives, for causing people to think about deferring gratification, of acquiring habits that make them creative and productive, and the economy has something to do with that. Thinking that a tariff or an industrial policy is going to somehow magically fix drug use in Youngstown, Ohio, I think is a gravely mistaken diagnosis and a gravely mistaken proposed solution.
Thank you. We have talked a good bit now about the common good, free trade, and what plagues the institution of the family. As we conclude, I wanted us to zoom out for a moment and ask how all these propositions hang together, if you will. In the concluding chapter of your book, you mentioned how the claim that none of these ideas you present today are new, and rather they authentically embody American values that go back as far as the American founding. As the American public grows ever increasingly dissatisfied with the chaotic political and economic situation that they're in, what do you think that this historic and grounded vision promises to them as an alternative?
So, as you probably guess, I'm not American. I'm an American citizen, but I was not born in this country. And one of the things that anyone who's born outside the United States, but who lives here, and has lived here for a long time, will tell you, is that the United States is in fact very, very different from pretty much every other country. Why is that? One of the reasons is that the American Republic is not based upon ethnicity. It's not something that's bound up with the types of national mythologies or stories or narratives that characterize the understanding of how people in France or Germany or Italy or Spain, Portugal, etc., how they understand themselves. America is defined by ideas, by sets of ideas that were crystallized at a particular point in history, that being the period of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitutional Convention, where these ideas very much coalesced in a particular shape and form. And many of these ideas are expressed in the documents and writings and lives of those who we call the American founders. No other country, I can tell you, is like that. Now, what does this mean? What it means is that these provide reference points, even checkpoints, which Americans can look back at and say, okay, are we actually being faithful to the principles and ideas upon which this republic was based? If you look at the American economy today, yes, obviously it's very different from the economy of the late 18th century. But is it faithful to the essentially market-orientated, commercially orientated type of economy that the founders clearly envisaged for this new republic? I think the answer would be no, right? I mean, no society, no country in which close to something like 40% of GDP is controlled by the government, which is the case in the United States. That doesn't sound sort of like a dynamic, free, competitive economy that was trading within its own boundaries and with the rest of the world. It doesn't sound very faithful to that. Constitutionally limited government. I think it's fair to say that the federal government and even state government has gone far beyond the parameters that were set out. But that's the point. We can go back and say, no, we've gone some way away from these guiding principles. And that provides us with opportunities to check ourselves and say, well, okay, how do we live out these principles, these timeless principles, in the conditions of the present? A modern 21st century society in which the geopolitical challenges are quite different from those of the late 18th century or even the mid-20th century. How do we live out these principles? So that's the great advantage I think America has. It can sort of judge itself by these principles and then say, well, how do we live these out in the contemporary world in which America finds itself? And that's why I talk a lot about this idea of a commercial republic. Because I think one of the mistakes that those of us who are free marketers, free traders have made over the past well, for a long time actually, is that curiously enough, we've talked a lot about the economics. And I love talking about economics, but we haven't talked as much about something we talked about at the beginning, which is the type of institutional and cultural and even moral principles and preconditions for a flourishing commercial society in which people are in fact free and able to pursue virtue in the context of a society that's very competitive, that's very dynamic, that's very entrepreneurial. And the idea of a commercial republic sort of gives us that. And if you want an idea of what this commercial republic looks like, just pick up Washington's farewell address. It's my favorite of all the founding documents. And what you find there, I think, is very much an argument for a commercial republic. So what's a commercial republic? It's a republic defined in part obviously by commerce, in which commerce is everywhere, in which a large proportion of people's time and energy and focus is spent engaged in commercial transactions, building businesses, being entrepreneurial, just buying and selling from each other, trading with each other, and trading with people from outside the United States. The founders talked a great deal about this. Now, there were some, like Jefferson, who would have liked us all to live in sort of little agrarian mini republics, but that was never going to work. But for the most part, if you look at most of the founders, this is their sort of vision of what they thought the political economy of this new republic would be, which would make it different from the top-down, centralized, often quite state-driven mercantilist economies that you found in Western Europe. But what's the republic side of the commercial republic? Well, it's these republican virtues. And by republican virtues, I mean the things that people like Smith and Scottish Enlightenment thinkers spoke about. Commercial virtues, classical virtues, and these virtues of benevolence, or what you might call religious virtues, all of which is held together by certain rights, certain institutions like private property, constitutionalism, rule of law, etc. Sovereignty, absolutely, yes. And these are the things, this is what I mean by the idea of a commercial republic. And I think this is very important because if you're trying to argue for free markets, you have to go beyond the economic side. The economic argument for markets is really important. In fact, if you don't make that argument, you don't make an argument at all. But unless you're willing to make these, let's call them extra economic arguments, these more philosophical, constitutional, legal, cultural arguments, I think you lose. I think you lose the argument to those who want a much more state-centric, much more interventionist, a society and an economy in which the state, rather than consumers or citizens, are the focus. And that's I think, the type of normative argument that we need to make. I mean, I think it was Friedrich Hayek who said that an economist who is only an economist is usually not a very good economist. That they needed to be able to talk about these types of questions. And I think one of the mistakes that maybe those of us who believe in free markets made was that we didn't talk about these other things, because I think that's the way you counter some of these narratives coming from the left and the right, which embody a very, very different vision of political economy that I would argue is not actually faithful to the founding vision of the United States.
Well, Dr. Gregg, it was delightful to engage with you in such an engaging discussion.